And again, in that, ask yourself if you saw the video 10 years ago, would you have predicted today? And you can see that prediction problem. And ask yourself if you also, if you see that, where will that be in 10 years from now? Because what you'll capture in your brain is that going forward, and you'll capture those machines going forward instead of them miniaturizing and AI moving everywhere and it looking totally different. That is a picture you'll capture. And you might see that picture with guns on it and everything else and who controls that picture, but you won't see what actually happens because technology is still moving at that rate. So you have these, and this affects everything. You have these collision of two giant forces. Technology on one side, wanting to free our time. If you think about money just as a concept, it's an abstract concept for our time. And we use technology to give us more time. That's why we use it. We could dig holes with spoons. We don't because we save time with technology. And that technology is now transferred to a point, largely because of those folds, to a point that it doesn't look like it used to. It's moving so fast, and it changes everything. And you have central banking, and I could have put inflation here or central banking. I'm not trying to do this to push, to say it's any person's fault. That's really important. It's a mistake of unable to grasp what's happening with technology in a system that's reinforcing itself. And those systems cannot work together. They're polar opposite systems. So what would it look like if you tried to drive inflation in a massively deflationary world? And think about what inflation is. We don't even question it. We say an economy requires inflation. Has anybody asked themselves why? Is there a rule that says we can't live in a productive society without money losing its value every year? Because 2% inflation is really just a theft that transfers money to the wealthy from the poor. And so we don't question the 2% inflation, or is that okay? Or 5% inflation isn't okay? 20% is it? We don't question. We don't say the rate of theft is okay or not. So you have a fraud based into the monetary layer. And I understand why when I say the fraud, those are harsh words. But it's why? Because you, me, everybody will always vote to get more than we can actually get. So we'll vote in people who tell us this little lie that we can pay for something that we can't. And so that system requires that, because we vote for that system, feeds back on itself and feeds back on itself and feeds back on itself, and it gets so large. And those two forces right now are getting further and further apart. So if you actually let deflation work in the natural economy, what would happen? A credit-based system collapses to the ground. Everything, every institution on top of it, bank failures, it would be horrific. But in the same breath, that's what has to happen at some point. So how do you deal with those things? So when I was writing my book, one of the things I thought, okay, if technology is moving this fast, there must be some artifact evidence that of being offset, that technology declining, right? Something must be pushing prices up and offsetting that. So this is the end of 2019, approximately $150 trillion of debt to run an $80 trillion global economy. But this was a smoking gun. $185 trillion of that debt came in the last 20 years. And so from the system, when you know one system's going one way, one system has to go the other, you could predict what has to happen with COVID. You could predict what has to happen with how much more debt has to go in to offset everything. And that debt, or that inflation, or to try to monetize that stealing from society to do it, what would that then move into? And the signposts are everywhere. That Amazon picture is from Mexico. In the slums, you have this Amazon warehouse. It's kind of stark. You have record inequality, because what is inflation? The other side of the coin of inflation is wage deflation. So you're telling an entire audience that we're going to pay you less so you have more jobs on an ever-increasing basis. So essentially you end up concentrating all wealth and control in very few hands as AI keeps moving, and what that looks like. And you get social destruction, you get the societal collapse all over the world. And that societal collapse is caused by, and those same people that are getting hurt most turn to the same governments who even if central banking was neutral, it can't stay neutral. It gets co-opted by governments, because the people demand that it gets co-opted by governments, because most of the people are hurt by the same process, but they don't know why. They haven't put it together why they're hurt from that process. And so, and you get regulatory capture, and you get and it keeps on accelerating. And we've seen this throughout history on these changes. We know most of the deflation is in front of us, not behind us. We have another path. We have the same path that we know that central bank, that currency cannot exist, that monetary policy can exist without that, and it has to keep printing, or you'll have a complete credit collapse and a depression that would make the Great Depression look on steroids. And so everything would collapse. And I often ask, which snowflake causes the avalanche? What people are doing is looking around at the snowflakes, talking about the snowflakes, instead of the system and the fragility that's building into the system because of this talk, because of this. And so it enters a paradox. And that paradox is a really hard thing for our brains to solve. And here's the paradox. Accelerating digital technology growth requires a digitally native currency that allows for deflation. And I'm going to put a caveat here. It doesn't require it if you concentrate all power and control in a small group of people who determine what's good for everybody else. It doesn't require it. Somebody could just say, I'm going to, and that is the path that we're heading without what I wrote here. That is the path. That is the path. That short-term nature to kick the can down the road is creating greater and greater instability all over the world. And a system built on credit can't allow that for fear of that cascading credit collapse. So how do you solve that paradox? Could central banks kind of make it? So today you have a world where with more and more mistrust, largely caused by when you have misinformation and money, you have misinformation everywhere. And so people are trying to, and so countries, through game theory and everything else, have the same, how do I do a trade with somebody I can't trust, everything else, and that's growing at an exponential rate because of the exponential rate of money printing. And so could there be an environment where a bunch of central banks get together and say, okay, we're going back to the gold standard? I see it as highly unlikely, but the bigger reason there is, this is the first time in history of this innovation in Bitcoin that you could actually remove that problem, because gold served for a lot of time as that stable currency, or holding systems in check. But what always happened with gold? Because it had to be centralized, it would always be captured and then repriced throughout time. And so it requires somebody else deciding. And that decision, and again, don't take yourself out of that decision process, because I think a lot of you would make the same decisions. We think we want everybody else to do one thing while we do another. And so we would elect the same people, and that decision, it creates this cascade of a credit-based system on top of it, and that credit-based system on top of it must keep expanding. And while you see these events through history unfold is because of the same thing. And Bitcoin is the only thing I've seen. I've looked everything. You can imagine if I'm talking here, I've really done this. It's the only thing I've seen that actually has a chance to forever remove humans from the loop in a monetary system. And I think that's actually a requirement, because humans are not, by history, are not great people to put in control of something as important as money or time. Central bank digital currencies is actually a natural extension of what has to happen in a system that must keep going. It's essentially saying that we can't do this from an independent central bank anymore. We have to drive it into government, which is going to be driven by people, and we have to control everything. We remove the banks from that process, and we do direct transfers. And you could look at that as central bank digital currencies as surveillance disguised as money. But that is where the world is going without Bitcoin. That is where the world is going. It's actually, that's why it's that important. It's critically important. And why will people do it? Because they'll get more for it. That's why this is. So our incentive structure kind of feeds back on itself. Why are people voting for socialism all over the world when it's a failed experiment all over the world? Because if you were them and you couldn't pay your bills and everything's going up, you're looking to the system to help you, because you don't know.